So around 2007, 2008, a little bit coincidentally that it happened to also be when the Bush administration was done, the Obama administration was in, but not entirely. There's kind of a shift in the way U.S. counterterrorism is done. And let me just explain why. Mostly it's because there's a debate that happens that makes things a little more complicated. So from that last one, we found out that so the early counterterrorism is basically blow them up. That never really goes away. The ones that can't be captured, the terrorists that can't be reformed, the ones who are the leaders, those are going to be the targets of killing. And as we get better tech, things like drones and things like that, that's going to continue as time goes on. But obviously, trying to kill off everybody who could potentially be a terrorist, that just was not a winning strategy at all. So compellents came along, and that idea was essentially, if the terrorists want this, the reason they're using terrorism is to get the government of the United States or of Syria or whoever to do something different, so you don't give them what they want. All right, so that leads us to leverage and Audrey Cronin. Now, again, she is not the leader of this. She is representative of this new shift that happens around this time. And here's the argument. I'm going to breeze this as a little bit quickly. Most a number of those things. So, terrorism is not monolithic, which means, as you saw in that video that we had of her, not all types of terrorism are the same thing. There's different goals, there's different organizations, etc. And so to just do a one-size-fits-all strategy just is not very good. The goal, if we're talking about the compellence model that we have, the goal is to change state policy. You're trying to get the U.S. or Europe or whoever to do something different, to do some different policy. The leverage, just to sum up the leverage one, the goal of a terrorism is not to change state policy. The goal is to win the people over. And when I say the people here, what I mean is, let's say whatever terrorist organization this is, we mean their people. Not the people in the organization, but the people who would likely become members of that organization. So Al-Qaeda, the odds are you joining Al-Qaeda very, very low. But back in 2000, somebody in Afghanistan, that might be a realistic possibility. Someone in Saudi Arabia, things like that. So that's the audience for the terrorist attack, not the United States or anything like that. Here's the standard process. Let me just break it down for you. I know you read the article. Let me just break it down very quickly. Number one, the organization generates fear or terror in a target population like the United States. Great. The U.S. then, the people then demand that government acts. Just like we were talking about the compellence argument. So far, it's very much the compellence argument. Now, remember compellence, what do? If they say get out of the Middle East, you stay in and get in harder. And what's going to happen is a population that's afraid is going to demand the U.S. government acts. And especially in democracies, there's not going to be a real limit on that. So the U.S. government's going to over-respond with force. So 9/11 happens and roughly 3,000 to 4,000 people are killed. And what's the United States response? The invasion of Afghanistan, the increase in the number of troops in the Middle East, eventually the invasion of Iraq. And so essentially a democracy, particularly a powerful democracy, can't resist over-responding with force. And what that's going to do then, it's going to help the organization's recruitment and strategy. And I'll talk about what PPM is here in a second. It's provocation, I can't even say it. Provocation, polarization, and mobilization. I got it out. And I'm going to talk about that here. And this is the thing. If you actually read bin Laden's writings before 9/11, he's not talking about, let's do this terrorist act to get the United States out. His whole thing is he's talking exactly about this idea of we need to, in fact, you know what? I'm going to add that to your readings. I'm going to do that. He is talking very much about, getting the United States to over-respond so that the people in the Islamic people in the Middle East, they can no longer be neutral on this. They have to make a choice between the evil West and the liberators. That's the idea. So let me just very quickly, 3 slides. I'm going to breeze through this as fast as possible. We have provocation. What she means by this is to try to force a state to overreact with vigorous action that then undercuts its legitimacy. So again, the argument being here, 9/11 happens, the United States goes into Afghanistan, goes into Iraq, and by the time it gets done with Iraq, the United States looks a little, I don't want to say foolish in the eyes of the rest of the world, but maybe that it just sort of went just, flinging around, and it undercuts its ability to do other things, its legitimacy. The success then of the terrorist action depends on the state's reactions. So how do you counteract this? The argument from Cronin is you don't overreact. And just keep that in mind, because this is a very important thing. Can democracies, particularly democracies that feel threatened, can they not overreact? Think about what's going on with the coronavirus right now. As people get more and more afraid, they're asking the government to do more and more things. Will they demand that the government do more and more to the point where it's maybe a little over the top? I don't know that to be true. I just know democracies tend to do that. A second P is polarization, where you try to divide the population and delegitimize the government. I don't want to go too far in depth on this. All I want to say is this. So ignore some of the things I'm going to pop up here. The idea being this. Let me just jump down here. Is that as this happens, as the terrorist action happens and makes the population more afraid, then they're going to demand the government do more things. And that doesn't just mean in the Middle East, for example. It also means doing more things to crack down on law and order in your own society to make sure terrorism doesn't happen in your own society again. So you get more centralized security apparatus for safety, like the USA Patriot Act, which sort of it really did challenge privacy rules. Or you could talk about temporary reduction in civil rights and liberties, where more people are being searched, particularly people that fit the criteria. Someone who's darker skinned maybe gets a rougher search than somebody who doesn't. Or we could talk about Guantanamo Bay, which doesn't really feel very, quote unquote, America and freedom. And so this idea of sort of trying to protect the population can create problems in terms of freedoms, privacy, etc. And that then forces the population to choose between the terrorist cause and a government that's seen as more repressive than it was. Okay, so that's another thing going on there. Now, this is probably not going to be as much happening in the United States. It's going to be more like, let's say, Egypt, where Egypt starts to crack down on terrorists in their area. And by doing that, they end up doing these things as well and catch a lot of, I guess you could say, innocent people in that crossfire. And then those innocent people then have to decide whether it's better to deal with a repressive Egyptian government or turn to this other group. One more group thing is mobilization, where you try to recruit and rally the masses of the cause. Remember, a terrorist organization is an organization, and organizations need members. And you have to recruit members. So the actions themselves can be recruitment tools. The target audience is the potential supporters, local and international, who haven't decided yet. The overreaction by the state then forces those undecided people to choose between them. I'm going to leave it at that. So terrorist groups in this sense can be seen as organizations or as social movements that use violence. And to the extent that you don't like, for example, what's happening with, I'm trying to think of a good thing, with the climate, that the government's not passing climate policy, and they're doing more and more things to harm climate policy. So you take to the streets, you get a little bit upset. It's a social movement. Terrorist group kind of works the same way, is that you just sort of, things just go in such a direction that becomes so problematic. And examples are like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, etc. All right, so let's just get to Cronin's findings here. Cronin's findings are democracies are as likely to respond with repressive measures as autocracies are. We like to think of democracies as freedom, and they are usually pretty free until people get scared. And then, or again, terrorism. I'm using quotes here, terrorism. And so then they want the government to react, and they often want them to react with repressive measures. Not on them, of course. They're fine. They want them to react to repressive measures on other people. And that creates some problems. Use of force, we often call that a strategic catharsis. A catharsis is where you're just sort of, like after a really emotional thing, you just bust out crying. That's a catharsis. You sort of an emotional release. And after something like a 9/11, there's this sort of pent-up fear and this desire to do something. And that's use of force is often the case when you have a very powerful state. There's this domestic pressure to do something. In the same way we kind of see again with the coronavirus. I hate to make those connections there, but with the coronavirus, it's not that the government can really, keep you from spreading coronavirus to somebody else, but for the government to do nothing, we want the government to do something. There's this pressure to do something. I don't really know what I want you to do. I just want you to do something. And something can sometimes be worse than others. And let me add one more thing. There was this, so Madeleine Albright was Secretary of State under Bill Clinton. And she was leaving when Clinton left office. And in was coming Colin Powell, who was going to be the Secretary of State under George W. Bush. And Madeleine Albright asked this question of Powell. She said, what's the good of having all this military, all this power if we don't do something good with it? And the modified Albright question is this: what's the point of having a great military if we can't use it for something like protecting ourselves from terrorism? And this becomes a really big thing. 9/11 happens, and we all know the United States was the number one military in the world, has the most force, and this thing happens in the United States. And if the United States is the number one military in the world, then the American people are going to demand the U.S. uses that military for something like this. This is not what Albright would have said, but this is the idea. Why have this great military if we can't protect ourselves from terrorism? So democracies are just as likely to respond, maybe even more likely to respond with repressive measures as autocracies. I wouldn't want to say more. Let's just say with as likely. So here comes the big thing that really is the sticking point today. So what that essentially means is if compellence strategies are don't do what they say. For example, if they want you out of the Middle East, put more. If the terrorist organizations want the U.S. troops out of the Middle East, stay in the Middle East and maybe even send more troops. Show them that terrorism doesn't work. But now, if you're following this leverage model here, it's a completely different thing, because that turns out to be the overreaction she's warning you about. So counterterrorism strategies that work against compellence are often going to backfire against leverage and vice versa. So if you think this is happening, if you think the terrorism functions under this model, the counterterrorism strategy that works there works great. But if it's actually under a different model, it's not going to work well at all. And this becomes the problem. And you're going to get this sort of vacillation within counterterrorism meetings. We should send more troops. We should pull our troops back. We should send more troops. We should pull our troops back. There's no good answer because there's two different models that suggest two different things. And the question of how do we know which counterterrorism strategy to use, the answer is we still don't really know that well. It's been, 9/11 was in 2001. It's been 19 years. We're still struggling to figure this out. We can do a pretty good job when terrorists take over land areas because America is good at fighting states. It's good at fighting organizations that fight like a state. We're not good at fighting organizations that don't fight like a state. And that becomes very problematic. So I'm kind of leaving us with that today. And so I have a discussion for you guys to do, and that is, and you'll see that here as we follow. So I want you to think about, A, what is the cause? What is the real cause? Like, why do organizations use terrorism? And based on that, then what do you think the best counterterrorism strategy should be? All right. See you guys.